Thank you. Can you hear me? Excellent. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I don't know what's occurred with the other speakers, but I wasn't aware that I was speaking until last night, maybe my fault. So I prepared this morning a brief 8-minute talk, but if I can go on for longer, then that's absolutely fine, because I do have an awful habit of doing so. And apologies if you hear any noise in the background. It's very early here in England, and I've got kids rushing out to school and all sorts of things. So that's part and parcel of it. But yeah, my name's Simon. I've 24 years detective experience here in England. I'm an advanced interviewer, and I'm also an interview advisor, working at the very highest end of criminality, so sexual abuse, slavery, homicide, and I've spent my life working with the most vulnerable of groups, including children. And the last 10 years, as well as working operationally as an interview advisor, I've also been educating detectives who have gone on to work on homicides, etc., and work within some very sensitive subjects. So I have an operational angle, and also an educational angle. I do have a first-class degree from Sunderland School of Law to support this, and my dissertation focused very much on the effects of memory and perception in witnesses. So some of the academic research that I've been hearing is absolutely fascinating, and links very closely to what I do. So I'm very grateful for some of the inputs that have been had already. 5 years ago, I set up my own investigation skills company, Zakons, and the reason being I saw a dire need for standards to improve across a lot of areas. I was frustrated that maybe the police culturally weren't pushing the training as much as they should have done. And working with interpreters all of my life, I didn't see any training within the police service in England at all. So I decided to run an event privately for interpreters 5 years ago, and I've seen over 1,000 since at my own workshops solely designed to bring practical education to interpreters working within police stations and the court. So that's a very brief summary of why I'm here. I get called the highest qualified interviewer in the UK, but I think that means absolutely nothing to me. It's more about the practical sort of experience, hopefully, that I can pass on with that underpinning legal knowledge. So I think the best thing for me to do, and I scribbled a few notes down last night, is just to go through the 6 questions without the time pressure I thought I'd have, because each of the questions are really good, and each one of the questions that have been posed, I could probably spend a day talking about, but I'll pick up on a couple of key points with each one. The first question is, what is the difference in the approach during the interview of a child or an adult? Now, that's huge, and there's lots and lots of variables, and then we have the witness interview and we have the suspect interview. So I thought we'd pick on the witness interviewing of a child witness, simply because there's been more legislation, more case law, more guidance in relation to the interviewing of children, child witnesses, than suspects. Interestingly, the suspect legislation in the UK is pretty much paced, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, and that came out with in 1984. So we very much are more focused on sort of the witness interview at present. But I don't let that dissuade me in any way, shape or form, because actually I see a lot of difference between how witnesses are interviewed and how suspects are interviewed. Now, at the end of the day, I think each should be interviewed to best practice, and there shouldn't be any judgment beforehand. So in terms of children, they're defined, certainly in England and Wales, and I appreciate there's a lot of people from around the world here, but certainly in England and Wales, a child under 18 is defined as vulnerable by virtue of the Youth Justice and Criminal Evidence Act 1999. We assume in this scenario an adult isn't, but an adult can also be vulnerable if they've got social functioning issues, mental health disabilities, learning difficulties, lots of different ways they can be vulnerable. Let's assume here, though, we're focusing on a child that is vulnerable by virtue of age. Now, because the child is vulnerable, they are eligible for a visually recorded interview. And here, the primary rule is that that video interview will be played as evidence in chief. And that's legislation under Code of Practice for the Victims of Crime 2015. So there's a fundamental difference there in that the non-vulnerable person will have their, the adult in this case, will have their interview recorded and put on a piece of paper, and a barrister will walk them through it. whereas a video interview is played before a jury, and the barrister, the prosecution barrister, would ordinarily use that as the evidence in chief. The difference there is that every professional involved in the interview of that child will have all of their work laid for all to see. So all of the questioning that the officer does, the interpretation of that questioning, therefore it's more likely that the integrity of every professional will be questioned. A, because the child is vulnerable, B, because it's likely to be potentially for serious crime, but C, because there's information and evidence there that the defence team can utilise to attack the credibility of the professionals involved. As I said, it was a big question, so I just pulled out one point there. One thing that I can do if I interview a child is spend a lot of time on rapport, far more than I would do ordinarily. So if you as an interpreter, a professional person, was to witness a crime, our rapport would be very quick. It would likely be, how are you? Probably share a cup of tea beforehand, the weather, television, what do you do for a job? Would very quickly, as professional people, establish that sort of rapport. With a child, and the younger they are, the longer it takes, I would spend a lot more time on rapport. Because if I don't have rapport from a witness, then I ain't going to get an accurate and factual account. And without an accurate and a factual account, then that is of no use to a court. And when I talk about rapport, I've worked with some children for 6 or 7 months before they've decided to disclose, for a variety of reasons. One such case, I know I've got a bit more time, so I can maybe mention this one that I had, was a teenage girl. There was a group of girls actually, but she'd effectively been raped by an older male. And there was an initial disclosure made by mum, who suspected something was wrong. When the child victim was initially spoken to by police, she wouldn't speak. I spent a number of occasions going to see her at school with a teacher present, and we literally passed time of day in the best way that we can. And about 6 months later, I got a call, and she said, "I'm ready to talk to you now." And actually, when it came down to it, the reason she was ready to talk is that her horse had died. And that was a key thing for me, because I said to her, "Well, why is it that you're ready to speak now?" And she said, "Well, he can't harm the horse now. The horse is dead. And he always said if I told anybody that he would kill my horse." So we'd already built that rapport. She was ready to speak, and we had a successful prosecution. Younger children, again, even more, that was a teenage girl. I'd consider even in rapport the way I dress. So the culture of the police, very much for detectives, is that you wear a suit, you'll appear very formal. And it took me a lot of education to work with senior leaders within the police to sort of suggest to them that that was in fact damaging, because we were wanting an adult relationship, even with a child, in terms of the dynamic and the conversation. In fact, the child is the important person in this interview, because it's them that hold the key to the information. So I've conducted interviews with children as young as 4, where I've literally worn shorts and a t-shirt, laid on the floor playing with a train set, and been supplementing our play with some questions around the kind of allegation, the offences. So there's some differences, but if I could sum it up, it's the visually recorded interview that's the way that the evidence is portrayed before the court. And if you're going to pull one thing out of that, then that would be rapport. So question 2, what is the biggest challenge during IMQM? So I took that as interpreter mediated questioning of minors. So what's my biggest challenge? I think having an interpreter present, the biggest challenge for me is the disruption of flow in the recall of the interviewee. Because being an advanced interviewer, I very much adopt a cognitive approach to the interview. So I will ask a child or a witness, providing that they're cognitively able to, a wide open question such as tell me, describe to me, explain to me. That's after rapport and explanation about the process, what's expected. That can take up sort of an hour anyway, so as they know exactly what's required. And then I literally pass the floor to them with a wide open question. The idea then is that the witness will, without without contamination, so the fewest questions as possible, relay as much information as possible. And I've had interviews where I've asked an open question, I've sat back for an hour, a witness has literally emptied their lungs and their brain of every single ounce of information, and I've then turned the video off. Okay. The great thing about that style of interviewing is there is far less chance of me influencing, contaminating. And I did mention to you, I'd done a dissertation on perception and memory. Every single question I ask, I run the risk of potentially altering somebody's perception or even their ability to recall the memory. When that then goes to an interpreter, the chance of that happening is then increased because of the difficult job that the interpreter has. Practically, when I work with a spoken language interpreter, the biggest challenge on top of that is that interpreters have got an exceptionally difficult job to do, and they cannot accurately remember more than 2 or 3 sentences, maybe on average at a time. So every 20 to 30 to 40 seconds, we're going to need a break in the recall for the interpreter to relay back to the interviewing officer what it is that the witness has just said. So whereas what I need to do is sit back and not really be apparent in the interview, and the child should be cognitively downloading, the interpreter's having to pause regularly to relay it back to me. So that very much is a challenge within the IMQM. Now, on a lot of my courses, I would say most of the workshops that I run for police and court interpreters, I have about 40% of my clients and delegates that are British Sign Language interpreters. They actually have less disruption to the flow of the interview because as the interviewee signs, then they are verbally telling me what the deaf person is saying. So in some ways, it is easier and less disruptive with a British Sign Language interpreter. But even then, there are other challenges, such as a lot of deaf witnesses, child witnesses, may well be very proficient at lip reading, for example. So it may well be I ask a question and that they then interject. But then having said that, without the interpreter interpreting, but having said that, then I do get a lot of witnesses that may be spoken language that can speak broken English, so the same thing there. So the key thing for me to address the challenge in both of these cases is to have a good briefing with the interpreter beforehand and set some sort of ground rules and establish the best way of working. And also with the child, just to say, you know, even if you hear what I say, even if you understand partly what I say, we do have an interpreter present. Please allow me to finish the question, them to finish interpreting it, and then you recall back through them. So even though that is a huge challenge, some of which we can't get around, we can mitigate it with covering some of those things on a briefing. There are many challenges, as you know. That's maybe just one of the biggest ones for me in answer to that question. So question number 3, how can you react on emotions on your own or the emotions of the child? So there are several questions there. One of the things that I'm wary of in interviewing is asking multiple questions, and I can see they're quite challenging to deal with. And I'll always try and avoid multiple questions actually when interviewing children, particularly because they are very hard to deal with. If I ask a multiple question consisting of 3 parts, research will say generally the witness will answer the last one. If not, the first one, and the middle one always gets ignored. So that's a bit of a trick there. Anyway, how can you react on emotions, your own or the child? Put simply, in any way, shape or form, I cannot react to the emotion from a child in an investigative interview. Any form of sympathy, acknowledgement, nod of the head, praise for speaking can be seen as non-independent, judgmental and leading. And in fact, the chief guidelines that we have in England and Wales for interviewing vulnerable people are the Achieving Best Evidence Guidelines in 2011. And they are very, very clear that that the officer should be impartial, shouldn't be judgmental, shouldn't be overly sympathetic. And I've actually interviewed during the course of the training work that I've done with the police, a couple of Crown Court judges that have been highly critical of officers that have shown sympathy, that have become emotional, that have reacted. And in fact, the forces where I've worked, we've had cases lost where the defence have successfully argued emotion, because that in itself has led the child, it's affected the recall, etc. Of course, what I will do, having spent months with a child building the rapport, is actually say to them beforehand, you know, I've kind of been this big, friendly, appropriately jovial guy that's been here to help you. You know, we've had fun, we've played trains, we've had chats, you know, we've shared glasses of Coke or whatever. However, when we go into the interview, I've kind of got to be quite straight-faced, and I'll explain this to the child, because, you know, my character is probably one quite extrovert, you know, use my personality to engage with the witness, to allow them to speak. But during the interview, I have to be very, very careful and make it clear to the child that I can't react to their emotion, because if I do, it will give the defence an angle of attack on the prosecution case, simply because it breaches guidelines. In terms of my own emotions, or the investigator's own emotions, it is a difficult one, because when I look at some of the cases I've had, such as maybe a baby raped so violently they've died, taking witness statements of a child at 4 years old that's seen mum stabbed to death by dad, they are very emotive cases. And I think my views changed actually as I've got older, have my own children. But ultimately, the interview isn't the place to show your emotions. Yes, you can come away from that interview and you can be as emotional as you like. But ultimately, the one thing that sticks in my mind, if somebody has, say, been abusive to a child, the goal is to put that person in jail. And ultimately, being emotional is really going to affect the chance of that happening. So, yeah, in summary, it's very, very difficult to deal with. If emotional support needed, that will be done later, but the emotion will not be shown within the interview. One of the things, due to my experience, I suppose, and love of working with interpreters over the years, both with the police and then privately, because I've got such an affinity to interpreters and wanted to help them so much over the years, I've always been very keen on working with them, not against them, and that's a bit of a question that comes up later as well. So I've always been very careful to give interpreters full briefings beforehand. That's nothing to do with legislation. That is just a duty of care to me, to the interpreter, because if I have an interpreter that midway through an interview, I show a photo, particularly in a suspect interview, of a child that's maybe been stabbed to death, and they become emotional, that can affect the child, it can affect them, and I've got a duty of care towards all concerned. So I will actually, if it's an emotive case, will brief all professionals within to say, look, you have to be prepared for some of the things that may or may not come out within this interview. So I think really that kind of sums that up. Okay, question number 4. Oh, this one's a little bit loaded. I'll have to be careful here. How do you choose or select your interpreters? Okay, I'm wearing 2 hats here. One is a police officer, one is a training provider. Within the police service, unfortunately, there is little choice, because they are chosen through an agency, and most police forces will have, or investigation agencies, because I do work, you know, with people outside of the police, they will have an agreement with an agency. A phone call will be made, and an interpreter will be allocated from the agency. It's not like it was 24, nearly 25 years ago when I joined the police, where I'd established rapport and a good working method with a number of interpreters, and if I needed them, I would simply make a call. They come to the police station, we work well professionally, and we got on with the job. The way that it works now is that we go through the agency, and I did not go through an agency for fear of breaching my own policies, and ultimately, if I do that, the interpreter may not be paid, quite bluntly, you know, which is something we don't want. The way that contracts are being awarded within England and Wales now is that there's a recent dynamic purchasing system being set up, a national police contract, and having a foot in both camps, I've tried to remain very, very independent. But this allegedly is going to ensure standards in quality services in terms of payment conditions, the service levels. And I really hope, because I've got so many interpreter clients that are now friends as well, that this agreement does work out. I suspect there'll be teething problems with it, but one thing is for sure, police will have to go through this in order to secure an interpreter's services. So, you know, my personal view is I just hope that the agencies ask the right questions. In terms of my own training, depending on whether the contract is with the police, it's my own work, it's maybe a contract with the medical world, which I'm doing some work with now. I have a bank of interpreters that I have with appropriate experience to call on, normally experienced DPSI and that sort of thing. And we'll have thorough conversations beforehand in what we expect and how we're going to work together. That's great for me because I'm kind of my own boss there, but within the policing, sometimes we have issues where an interpreter will get a call from an agency. They'll say, what's the name of the client, where they're from, what's the case? And some police officers will refuse to tell them on the phone. Now, I really can't understand that because particularly the deaf community are very, very small, as are some of the more niche languages in England, spoken languages. And it doesn't serve anybody's purpose if a victim or even a suspect is awaiting an interview. We wait a couple of hours for an interpreter just to turn up to find out, for example, they know them and they have to go and start again. So the choice and selection of the interpreters is often out of the police's hand, and it is a difficult one there. So number 5, the question there is, how do you work with the interpreter? Again, this is another multiple question. Do you include the interpreter in the team, or do you consider the interpreter as an outsider? Okay, this is my view. Obviously, I am influential. You know, run a lot of interviews and have a lot of people that work for me running interviews, but this is still my view. The interviewing officer, the intermediary and interpreter are all independent professionals. All have the combined goal to ensure that the child can give the most complete and accurate account as possible with the least contamination, so as their memories of the incident are relayed to the jury as untainted as possible. So my view there, you can see, is very much they are one of the team. We're independent. There's a culture where maybe, you know, interpreters believe, the police believe themselves that the police are there to prosecute. That is not the case. The police, and by extension, interpreters and intermediaries, are independent gatherers of fact. The interviewing officer is independent. They will ask questions independently. The interpreter will faithfully interpret those questions and the answers relayed. It is therefore the prosecutor's role to put that case before a jury with that least contamination as possible. But in terms of team, yes, I would say that pretty much it is a team approach for sure. Now, the possible culture, I would say from the police perspective, that some interpreters may well find is a case of us and them. And one of the reasons I was so passionate, having worked with interpreters all my life, about running education events, is that I wanted this apparent culture for the police to diminish through education. Now, one thing that I struggled with for 10 years, as I briefly mentioned, is getting police to run interpreter training, and it just has never happened with any success. I go to the interpreters and do a single session as a bit of a give back, and I'm full, and I've run dozens of events since. So that shows me the culture of change is far easier and more effective with interpreters, which is a credit to the interpreting profession. It really is. And that's why interpreters are one of my favourite audience to work with, because they work so hard. It is difficult to get around that education, that culture with the police. However, I can give you a tip here, because Achieving Best Evidence guidelines state that interpreters should be involved in the planning process and have a clear understanding of the process, structure and objectives of the interview. And it's something that I cover in full on my own workshops. So the wording in ABE would very much suggest part of the team and that interpreters are integral to the process. That little point there is well worth remembering, because interpreters tell me every single day that they turn up to a police station, they ask for a briefing, and officers are like, oh, well, no, we can't really talk about that. It'll all come out in the interview. Almost seeing you as an us in them, or maybe they don't maybe trust that you're not as independent. And I do understand where police maybe are coming, that they're wrong, but I do understand where they're coming from potentially, because it may well be that you do speak a language from a very small community. It might be that the officer perceives there's kind of some friendship, particularly if you have worked with this child before, whether it be witness or suspect. It's a course that I'm hoping will change. It will change with education, but at least the interpreters are aware they're in guidance, that they form part of that team, and they do have certain rights, including this particular briefing. Okay, and that's just one small part there. So 6, what do you do if the interpreter you recruited is not up to the job? Wow. And what do you do if you find out the interpreter knows the child, is a family member, or closely linked to the child's acquaintances? Okay, so what do you do if the interpreter you recruited is not up to the job? So basically, if an interpreter shows up and they're not up to the job, what I would recommend doing is shooting them, burying them, requesting another interpreter, and pretending that they never showed up. No, that's not what we do, is it really? That was my idea of a joke there. And interestingly, it's a bit of a live experiment, because one thing that I'm always learning is from cultures of all my friends, clients, that were interpreters. And actually, if this was a group of police officers, and I made that statement, the English police officers would be laughing, because they would immediately understand that I was actually using humour to make a point. The Russians would be making a note on how to shoot somebody. The Italians wouldn't be listening, because they'd just be partying. So again, there's different kind of culture there. If the interpreter's not up to the job, seriously, what I would have to do, unless it was to safeguard life due to immediate risk, and I had absolutely no choice, I would request another interpreter. And this is where you really rely on the agencies that I mentioned beforehand to send appropriately qualified and accredited interpreters, because it is law that we have to have appropriately qualified interpreters. And the audience I'm speaking to today obviously sit in that category, because you're here getting CPD around some fantastic subjects. The reason being that I would have to insist on another interpreter is that the defence's role is simply to undermine every single aspect of the case. And if a case is tight evidentially, this invariably will mean that the process, investigation, and the decision making behind it comes under real scrutiny. So as an interview advisor, my advice would be to investigation teams, record an appropriate rationale and request another interpreter. Now, I did say that I would give you practical advice from sort of the shop floor. I have to be honest, if this was a low-level crime like a shoplifting, then potentially, in the grand scheme of things, it probably isn't going to matter, but it's not ideal. If this was a crime going to Crown Court and there were barristers unpicking every single part of the case, that is when every professional, including the interpreter, can potentially have their work within the investigation really scrutinised. And it's not just the case as well, because they're trying to undermine it. It may well be you're asked by the defence your qualifications, your experience, your knowledge of this case, whether you've dealt with anything previously, what gave you the right to be there interpreting that offence. And interpreters are telling me more and more they're actually being called into witness box as witnesses about their own credentials as well. Now, this puts a lot of interpreters and police officers uneasy, really. But what I would say is if the defence are getting to that level of scrutiny, the case is normally very evidentially sound. So, you know, in some ways, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But to sum up, really, if we have a child witness that is being visually recorded, evidentially, it's a fantastic opportunity to put a child before a jury. It's a fantastic opportunity for the interviewing officer to ask open questions and allow the child to speak directly through to the jury from the video screen. The barristers have as little input as possible there from the prosecution angle, but the challenge is how we get around the disruption of that cognitive flow when the interpreter is present doing their role. And they're the questions.